Once again, welcome to AJA Lunchtime Live. I'm Kimberly Carroll. I'm the Animal Justice Academy Director. Our topic today is turning our animal advocacy to corporations with PJ Nyman. And I want to welcome all of you beautiful beings here with us live, and a welcome to those of you who are watching the replay. We appreciate all of you and your time. So folks, we're going to talk about the power of corporate advocacy today in the animal protection movement. And PJ is going to unveil Mercy for Animals 2022 Canada Animal Welfare Scorecard, which was just released yesterday. So this is hot off the presses. Let me give you a little bit of background on PJ. PJ is a senior corporate relations specialist with Mercy for Animals. They earned their master's degree in social and political thought from York University and have been active in the farmed animal protection movement since 2014. Based in Toronto, PJ works with Canadian food companies to adopt and implement meaningful animal welfare standards. And they help to launch Canada's first comprehensive corporate animal welfare ranking, which we're going to be talking about. PJ also previously served on the board of Encompass, which was a really important capacity building organization, which really worked to advance the racial equity in the animal protection movement. So PJ, welcome.
Thank you, Kimberly. Hello. Thank you so much for having me. Hi, everyone.
Yay, lots of folks here to, participate today. We've got almost 60 people now. PJ, go. No, I'm just kidding. Feeling pressure. Well, first of all, PJ, I just want to say, I have a special kinship and Animal Justice has a special kinship with MFA. Myself as well as Camille, and we've talked about this. We're founding directors of MFA Canada way back in 2012. And so MFA holds a special place in my heart. And also, Rhiannon Henkelman is now working with you. Rhiannon was one of our coordinators here at AJ, helped us launch this, was instrumental in it. And we're also looking forward to working with you and MFA more as Animal Justice takes part more in some corporate campaigns. So first of all, PJ, can you explain, what do you do as a senior corporate relations specialist? Give us a little rundown.
Yes, happy to do that. And thank you for the generous introduction. And just love all the work that you're doing with this academy and what Animal Justice does. Very excited too for what's to come for Animal Justice's work. So for me, I've been working with Mercy for Animals for the last 2 years. And what our corporate relations work looks like is basically talking to food companies and trying to make the case to them and apply pressure to get them to adopt meaningful animal welfare standards and also to ensure that they're implementing those standards. So that because the job is, corporate relations, it's very specifically trying to work with companies collaboratively through friendly dialogue, building relationships over time, kind of acting as sort of a consultant, showing them which animal welfare issues are the most critical for them to look at. What are we seeing across the globe in terms of what other countries are doing with animal welfare? What are their competitors elsewhere and in Canada doing when it comes to animal welfare, and kind of elevating for them animal welfare as a corporate responsibility issue. And so my job is maintaining a portfolio of dozens of companies who I engage with and develop relationships with to work with them on some of the key issues that we've identified as areas where they can have the most impact to help farmed animals.
Yeah, and PJ, that's such a good reminder that, there are corporations everywhere that are scrambling to, get all of these sort of social justice pillars in place. And this is the perfect time to remind them that animal welfare is also one of those pillars. So I love that. So PJ, a lot of Canadians hear about the horrific conditions for farmed animals, and they think, never mind companies, the government needs to do something about this. Can you explain why corporate outreach is needed, as opposed to just putting all of our attention towards changing laws?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'll say for starters, as I'm sure like many people in this group are aware, Canada doesn't have federal animal welfare legislation. And the council that oversees the codes of practice for industry, the National Farm Animal Care Council, or NFAC, sets guidelines that are not enforceable. and that are in some ways very behind what we know from animal welfare science and what we see happening in countries in Europe, and in some ways in states in the US. And so we know that we're behind when it comes to on some issues, when it comes to laws and also to industry regulations. And so corporate outreach is this, non-legal route to basically channel public opinion through companies who are actually purchasing animal products. So companies like large retailers in the country, for example, purchase 60% of the chickens that are raised in the country. So of, close to 1 billion chickens raised every year for meat in Canada, 60% of those are purchased by the large grocery stores. And so getting those companies to commit to standards that will phase out some of the most horrific practices in on factory farms in Canada is a way to influence industry in a way that's not going through the regulations themselves or through legal advocacy, because companies are operating in this unique place of being between the consumer and the industry. And there's a lot that consumers can do. There's a lot that advocates can do to influence industry, but at the same time, we're not the ones buying the products. We're not their consumers. And so those big corporations are the ones who are buying. And so that's how we see them positioned, is that in between consumers and industry. And so getting to on their radar what the animal welfare issues are, highlighting for them that the public cares about these things, can be really effective in getting that message across to industry, who otherwise I think would be inclined to maintain the status quo.
And corporations, companies, they seem far more responsive to public pressure than government. Like maybe government, feels public pressure, but they move at a glacial rate in responding to it.
Yeah, I would say definitely that's the case, that companies are, and Canadian companies too, are very sensitive to public pressure. There have been, in cases in the past where there have been public protests or demonstrations that target particular companies, we see them responding really quickly. It's not something that is as widespread as we see in the US, like corporate campaigning. So Canadian companies definitely take note when that happens. And also they care what their consumers think. They ask us show us the latest studies. What are people saying? They want to listen. These are the issues that they're focused on. And oftentimes too, I'm talking to folks on corporate teams who are in their sustainability or corporate responsibility departments, which means it's kind of their job to pay attention to these issues. And so we're able, to bring those to them.
Mm-hmm. And so, let's just talk about the elephant in the room, which is the glacial sort of pace of the government in responding to animal welfare concerns by Canadians. Can you talk a little bit about the concept of agricultural exceptionalism and how that, all ties into why we need to go to corporate?
Yes, absolutely. And interestingly, I wasn't familiar with the term, but realized it was exactly what I was seeing through my work in the last couple of years. And then it was actually at the recent Canadian Animal Law Conference where my panel had this in the title. And I was like, this is exactly what I've been noticing. Okay, there's a term for this. So yeah, I'm happy to share, what I've been learning, which is basically that agricultural industries are excluded from standards that apply to other industries. They're seen as this exception in the economy when it comes to labor standards, wages, human rights, environmental issues, and certainly animal welfare. And so and we see this in Canada, where these industries are given, exceptions in terms of how they're regulated. There aren't federal animal welfare laws. And also what we see from, new ag-gag laws is that industries are increasingly also shielded from public scrutiny. So agriculture exceptionalism is this idea that the agricultural industries are seeing themselves, and government is seeing them, as an exception to the same standards that we would expect from other industries, and from being, seen through the public eye, and having activists being able to no longer being able to document without facing legal penalty. These are all things that really shield the industry from being held to the same standards that others are.
Mhm. And so, and I mean, not that you know the definitive answer to this, but I guess some would say this agricultural exceptionalism comes from the fact that we're talking about food, which is super sacred to, the population, but also there's some powerful animal agriculture industry lobbying that goes on, around the world. But in Canada, it's really strong. Yes.
I mean, yeah, yes, absolutely. I mean, if you look at the public members page of the National Farm Animal Care Council, for example, that's setting codes of practice for the industry, it's anywhere from 75 to 85% industry groups. So, it's the fox guarding the hen house. It's industry groups deciding on their own regulations and then like touting this approach as being collaborative and multi-stakeholder and including animal welfare groups. But those groups have a very small voice. And we know that it's basically industry deciding on their own regulations. I also learned recently that when those codes of practice are evaluated every 5 years, it's actually up to industry to decide whether they even want to go through a public evaluation. So that's another way that they're able to like remove themselves from public scrutiny for longer periods of time.
Wow, unbelievable. So, corporate advocacy has been highly influential, especially again in the States. We're a little newer here in Canada. Can you talk a little bit about how corporate advocacy has helped to end some of or is helping to end some of the most abusive practices in animal ag? Can you give some examples
Yeah,
of campaigns?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. There's one issue in particular that was pretty successful, and then I can talk about one that's like more emerging now. One example is veal crates in Canada. So we know that in 2014 there was an investigation put out by Mercy for Animals that focused on a veal farm in Quebec. And we saw, we're able to publicize the horrific cruelty that's involved in keeping, young calves in crates. And as a result of the investigation and outreach to companies that was happening, alongside that investigation, we saw producers and major grocers all commit to phasing out the use of veal crates.
Mhm.
And just a few years later, NFAC also updated their code of practice to ban veal crates. I mean, it didn't go far enough. They still allowed them for a certain period of time after the calf is born. But the point is, there was something that went into effect as an actual industry regulation as a result of that. And it put the issue on companies' radars because they started adopting public policies. And then therefore, a few years later, NFAC actually updated those standards. So that would be an
Mhm.
example of one where that's an example too that shows how well footage that is, comes from industry can be coupled with corporate advocacy,
Yeah.
and then making sure that those things are presented to industry as well, so that they're seeing, that the public is aware of this.
It's
And then
huge. It's huge, PJ. And I remember
definitely,
that was the last the last investigation I worked on personally at Mercy for Animals Canada.
okay,
And I mean, first of all, one of the ones that hit me the hardest. And the people aren't willing to play until there is something out there that's sort of lighting a fire under their butt. So it's a
yeah.
really important piece of the corporate puzzle, I think.
I think so too. And a more recent example is phasing out battery cages on egg farms. So this is one where there's still a lot of issues. There's a lot of work to be done, but we've also seen quite a bit of progress on the issue because of at least in connection with corporate commitments. So, for example, there's like over 100 companies in Canada that have cage-free egg commitments. Most of those commitments have 2025 deadlines. And we're seeing that of the prominent companies that we've been looking at who have these policies, about half of them are reporting progress toward actually banning cages from their supply chains. And there are 11 who've fulfilled their policies already, which means they've completely transitioned from keeping hens in battery cages or allowing that in their supply chains. So that would be another example where there's more to be done, but the fact that these companies have policies and some of them have been actually working toward fulfilling them has shifted some production and increased, decreased how many hens are kept in those cages, increased how many of them are no longer in cages.
And so, I think it's important to talk a little bit about, we're sort of here in AJA, of course, we have many of us are vegan, many of us are working towards animal liberation. And there are a lot of folks out there. In fact, John just said, um, uh, publishing rankings like you do can be construed as approval ratings for the companies listed. For example, and we'll get to this in a second, Whole Foods has a gold rating. Isn't this counterproductive for animal justice? So, some people would argue and do argue, and this is not just some people, this is a big argument that goes on in our movement around whether welfare, working towards welfare and these corporate welfare standards is actually hindering the animal freedom movement rather than helping. So I'm sure you get this all the time, PJ. What's your answer to this?
Yes, it's a really good question. And it's something that I do think about a lot myself. When I entered the animal rights space in, I want to say like 2012, 2014, that's when I was like reading everything. And the welfare rights debate was like all that everyone talked about at that time in, the communities that I was in. So it's something I do, pay attention to and think about. What I'm seeing now doing this work and talking to companies is that, well, there's a couple things for me that really show why this work is important and not counterproductive. The first is putting animal welfare on the radar of large food companies as a matter of corporate responsibility. Without animal advocates talking to companies about animal welfare, and I want to also add that we also talk to them about increasing their plant-based offerings. That's another part of our work, which is very important because our mission is to end industrial animal agriculture by constructing a new food system, and that means that we would need to have plant-based options everywhere. And so that's one piece. But when it comes to animal welfare and working with companies, what we're actually doing is bringing that into their portfolio of what it means to be a responsible company. And so when they're looking at sourcing and they're looking at issues like palm oil or how textiles are produced, they were saying, well, you also have to look at how animals are treated in your supply chain. And our approach is to look at what are the most egregious forms of cruelty, what are the aspects of producing meat, dairy, or eggs that are causing the most suffering to animals. Can we get these companies that are going to be buying these huge quantities anyway to at least ban those practices and to be talking about animal welfare and to be elevating it as a corporate responsibility issue? And then also I'll add, this is because of this kind of work, animal welfare is also now an emerging ESG issue. And ESG is, environmental, social, and governance issues, factors, sorry. And those are ESG factors are, for those, I'm sure many people have heard of this term, but for those who aren't familiar, they're basically non-financial risk factors that investors look at when they're evaluating which companies to invest in. And so by putting animal welfare into the conversation, we're now seeing some of the world's most used ESG metrics, adding questions for companies about animal welfare. So for example, one of the bigger ones, it's called SASB, that's an acronym, SASB, it now has questions for companies that report through that system on what percentage of the eggs you sell are coming from caged hens, what percentage of the pork you sell is coming from pigs who are kept in gestation crates. And so it's elevating animal welfare globally as part of corporate responsibility and as one of the issues that companies have to look at when they're looking at environmental, social, and governance factors. So that's like the sort of high level, more intellectual reason in my view. The other reason is emotional. For me, I started off working in this movement at a farmed animal sanctuary, and I was able to participate in several large-scale rescues of hens from egg farms. And these were legal rescues. I worked for Animal Place, which is a sanctuary in the US who does these large-scale rescues. And I saw hens in battery cages, hens not in battery cages, hens on free-range farms where they were outdoors, some where they weren't outdoors. And I could really see what the difference was for those animals. I'm not saying by any means that raising chickens for eggs is okay, or that it's good to do it in a free range way. But from the animal's perspective, I think it makes a big difference. And when I think about those individuals that I like pulled out of battery cages and how much better their lives would have been if they weren't in those cages, if I were them, I would hope there was an advocate trying to get them out. Because, and I know that this isn't, I know that not everybody agrees with this, that, I get those reasons as well. And I think for me, it's thinking about those individuals affects me emotionally. And I know that thinking of how many years more there will be hens raised for egg production makes me think that it's important that there's at least some parts of the animal advocacy movement that are trying to get hens out of cages, while the other work is being done to, phase out this kind of farming altogether.
PJ, thank you for that heart perspective. That's really important to hear, because yes, we can get very pragmatic, and we do have to be pragmatic on some level as animal activists, but we have to remember there are billions of animals that are in these most egregious situations. And you're right, they would get me out of here, even if it's a step out of that cage. I think another piece that, tell me if I'm wrong, that I think is also important to talk about when we talk about why animal welfare isn't necessarily working against animal freedom is how much welfare improvements will cost the industry. Is that a factor you talk about or consider?
I mean, I think it is for Mercy for Animals as an organization, certainly. And I think for our movement, we know that if we improve welfare standards, that it will require less production and higher costs. At the same time, when we're doing corporate advocacy,
you can't lead with that.
We're highlighting the companies that they can continue to do the business they do and care about animal welfare at the same time. That it's not a matter of turning something that they're doing into something that like nobody's going to buy because it's so expensive. That's not, I guess, so I just want to distinguish between what is beneficial from the perspective of corporate campaigning versus what we hope for as a movement in the long run, which would be to make this way of farming not sustainable for multiple reasons.
Yeah, and I guess the one other critique that comes up strongly is, once we give people the happy meat, they're not going to be interested in going vegan or decreasing. They're just that it's going to encourage them to keep going the way they're going. And anything you can speak to around that?
Yeah, I mean, my experience and from what I've read in terms of like research on people who do purchase higher welfare products is that they generally start eating more plant-based as well, that those behaviors go together, that it's sort of a foot in the door for people to buy a higher welfare product when they're not going vegan yet, in terms of them starting to identify as somebody who cares about animals and who pays attention to this. So if you think about, what it's like as a vegan to read labels, it's kind of starting people on that path in a way when they're starting to think about where their food comes from and look at labels and think about how animals are treated. So I don't know that I haven't come across anything that shows that when people are buying higher welfare products, they're buying more or they're not going plant-based as a result. I think that these things are mutually compatible, like increasing people's interest in veganism, increasing, the plant-based market, while also improving welfare for the animals who are still in the system now.
Well, thank you. That's I'm glad to hear about that research. Really important. So tell us, PJ, what are some of the global corporate campaigns that you're finding exciting right now?
Sure. I'm happy to talk about one in particular that's a Mercy for Animals campaign, because our
Mm,
global team has been working on this, and it's an interesting approach that I think is sort of newer in our movement. This is a campaign against Delaware North, who is a global food service and hospitality company. As far as I know, they don't operate in Canada, but they're headquartered in Buffalo. And so this is a company that owns like casinos, sporting venues, I think like airport food operations, and they're a global company. They have a cage-free egg policy in particular countries. I think they have policies in the U.S. and the U.K. But they're excluding all of their Asia Pacific operations in this policy. And so the campaign is asking them to extend the policy globally. And we're seeing this tactic used increasingly as we're getting more of a global view on on animals in cages and what we need to do about this. So we're watching the issue, become more and more global, and a way to take action and make meaningful change is to look at global companies and look at what regions are they excluding from their policies, because it's an equity issue. There are companies who are shifting markets in like wealthier industrialized countries and excluding others who also have the production of the same products and have people who care about animal welfare. So that campaign in particular is asking that company to extend their policy to all of their operations. And it came out of another report that Mercy for Animals has been doing for the last couple of years that I wanted to mention for folks who are more interested in the global aspect of this movement, which is the International Cage-Free Equity Index. So this is a report that looks at global companies and looks at to what degree they are actually applying their policies to all the regions that they operate, and to what extent they're actually implementing their policies in all of the regions that they operate. Because similar to having companies who only have standards in some regions, companies also sometimes only implement and report progress in some regions. So it's trying to sort of expand the reach of companies who are already taking some action in some places. And the campaign site for anyone who wants to check it out is just DelawareNorthCruelty.com. And there's an action there as well on the homepage that folks can take.
Amazing. Any other little mentions of any other campaigns that you've been impressed by or you're excited by in the world?
I mean, I would say like I've been pretty focused on the ranking reports myself. So
Yes.
that's,
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
where my focus is for the most part. But I will also mention that Mercy for Animals also launched another investigation recently, which is on our homepage, Animals Under Attack. And this is footage from a pig farm, and it was in connection with the Prop 12, the Supreme Court of the U.S. last week, or sorry, this week, earlier this week, hearing oral arguments from the industry, basically challenging Prop 12, which was a welfare bill that included welfare issues for pigs. And so that, we released the investigation footage as part of, raising awareness for that around that case and the welfare issues that are, being brought now at a national level in the US. So that's another one that I've been, following this week.
Now, PJ, there are two quite different sort of approaches to corporate engagement, and one is playing nice and one is not playing so nice. And there's quite a difference between them. So that's got to be a tough line to walk. And can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'm happy to. And it plays into like a lot of our decision making, I think, in our corporate engagement department, which is, what we have the same goal. We want to see, animals suffering less. We want to see them removed from the food system. And how are we going to get there? So it's usually for us a matter of what's going to be more effective. And what the goal is. So if the goal is to get a company to adopt a policy this year, we would have to decide, does it make sense to talk to them, in a collaborative way? Does it make sense to campaign? What's going to achieve that goal? If the goal is to say, like, raise public awareness about a particular welfare issue, it might not matter if we have to have a relationship with a company that we target or not. So I think that as advocates, it's important to start with like, what is your goal? What are you hoping to accomplish with the campaign? And then look at, if you're targeting companies, what are the companies doing in that space, and what would you be able to achieve if you targeted them based on the relationship you have, who else has relationships with them. So for me in particular in Canada, like we are doing corporate relations work. We're not, at this time doing campaigning in the traditional sense of like targeting a particular company. But it is very important, and it's something we consider because we want to make the most change. So we've found for the most part, which is why my role is what it is, that in Canada, companies are pretty responsive to us when we're trying to get meetings and just talk to them. So that's an approach that we're favoring. But also campaigning is very important when companies are not doing what they say they will do. And also, especially because part of the work I'm doing through friendly dialogue is trying to get public commitments. So when a company makes a public commitment, they're publicly accountable to uphold that commitment. And so we can try to ensure that they're fulfilling their commitment through talking to them. But there also might be cases where they're not doing that because they need public pressure. They need the same public pressure that got them to say adopt the policy to implement the policy. So I'd say like it's really based on what the goals are and overall strategy, which approach to take, and they're both very, very important.
But generally, it sounds like on sort of both a corporate level and just even a smaller business level, it's always smarter to at least approach, get a feel for where they stand on things, have a dialogue, and then you can sort of decide your strategy from there.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think in terms of the work I do anyway, so just doing this in a professional context for an organization like Mercy for Animals, who's known in the country, I can do that where I can, get meetings with companies and they're willing to talk to us. I would say for others, it can be really useful to just let them know you're really mad about what they're doing, even if you don't know where they're at. It's so I feel like we need kind of all approaches. We need people who are a little more on the inside, scoping out like what are they like, who are their staff, what do they care about, what are they most susceptible to in terms of pressure, what do they care about, and then there's also the need for just sustained public pressure, like showing companies that the Canadian public cares about animal welfare. Animal welfare is not going away, and we will continually pay attention to what they're doing when it comes to, cruel practices in their supply chains.
And for example, just again, working on campaigns at Mercy for Animals Canada and MFA Canada, when we were a separate chapter, we got a commitment from the Retail Council of Canada to phase out the most egregious practices, and that was because of undercover investigations and going hard after them and targeting them. And once the pressure was off, all of a sudden those commitments started to soften. And so it is important to, again, hold the light under the butt. And PJ, we've been talking with PJ because Animal Justice, we have been doing more and more undercover investigations, and we plan on doing more and to be able to be that light under the butt more, so that PJ can then go in and be the consultant that can really help them, push them towards fulfilling those commitments that they make. So we're excited about that, PJ.
Me too. And also that was a great summary, because I think you really just showed how these things work hand in hand, that it's like the sustained public pressure combined with having some advocates who have a direct relationship really goes a long way in making sure that change happens.
So, PJ, we have a couple things that are important that we need to cover, and one is we want to talk about some individual activism on the corporate level. But there is a project that we've talked about throughout this, but we haven't, really dove into it. So, tell us about the Canada Animal Welfare Scorecard. This is a project that you've been particularly involved in creating, and so yeah, give us a little idea of it and the new scorecard that came out yesterday.
Yes, happy to talk about it. So this is the only report of its kind in Canada to focus on how food companies in Canada are doing on animal welfare. So there are a number of global company rankings, issue-specific rankings, and what we were seeing, at the time when I was coming into the role, is that Mercy for Animals has been involved in almost every corporate animal welfare commitment in the country. This is, at least 150 policies, many more, likely many more than that, from cage-free, crate-free, broiler chicken issues. Sorry, I'm using industry language. The veal crate issue we spoke about earlier. And so seeing all of these commitments, we want to make sure that companies are actually following through. And so we've noticed that ranking reports have been a very effective tool in holding companies accountable to fulfilling their commitments. And we hadn't seen an accountability tool like this in Canada yet, or any kind of assessment of how companies are doing and actually fulfilling the policies that they committed to publicly, really over the last 10 to 15 years. So we decided to look at the 3 issues that we'd worked on most closely and that also have the most traction globally, which is, hens confined in cages on egg farms, pigs confined in crates on farms, and then issues affecting chickens raised for meat. And so we wanted to look at these 3 areas and pick who are the biggest companies in the country who are well known, do they have policies, and are they actually following through? And so we developed this public ranking report, which we work on through the whole year leading up to the launch. So I'm really excited to share it with all of you because we've been doing this for many, many months and just like waiting excitedly to share it with everyone. Because what we were able to do is rank 55 of the biggest food companies in the country on what they're doing for animal welfare. So we break down scoring based on the 3 issues I mentioned, the quality of the policies of the companies, and the quality of their progress reporting. So are they being transparent? Are they reporting specifically on their operations in Canada if they are a global company, for example? And so that's, that's what we're doing, is highlighting these are the commitments, this is what the companies are doing, and using it as an accountability tool, both for our work, but then also for the Canadian public to actually see what companies are doing. And I'm happy to share, after this too, some ideas on how folks here can get involved and take action. Once you're looking at the report, you might be like, well, what do I do about this? I have some great ideas of actions that you can take that would be really effective.
Before we get to that, because we're excited to hear about this, can you just give us a little overview of some of the key takeaways from this year's scorecard?
Yes, definitely. So what we found is that the area where companies are making the most progress in terms of reporting progress, and so that's like being transparent and then also making commitments, is definitely the cage-free egg issue. That's where we've seen, by far the most policies, but also the most reporting. So of the 55 companies in the report, half of them were reporting progress, which means that they're publicly releasing a number. Like, we are sourcing 20% of the eggs we source are from cage-free hens. They release a public actual number, and then we follow up with them every year, of course, to ensure the number is increasing. And so that there's about half of them are reporting progress. 11 of those 55, so I guess that's 20%, have fulfilled those policies for cage-free, so they've gone completely cage-free. But I will say a couple of issues that we are highlighting that are problems are that not nearly enough companies are being transparent about eliminating gestation crates. So we know that it's an issue that Canadians care about. People love pigs, and unfortunately, even though there are a lot of companies with policies, we're not seeing a lot of transparency on the issue, and we're also not seeing enough action from retailers in the country to address chicken welfare. Chickens, as we know, are like 90% of the farmed land animals in the country, and not a single retailer in Canada has made a public commitment to chicken welfare, even though in the US there are 12 companies that have. In Europe there's over 40. In the UK there's 4 major retailers, and in Canada none of them have done this. I will say that Metro addressed it this year. That was a huge win for us, that Metro did actually publish what percentage of their chicken supply are meeting 2 of the standards. So that's that's really great. They also acknowledge the better chicken commitment as the higher welfare standards, but we're not seeing enough action from retailers on the issue at all. And then a couple of specific company highlights. Those in the gold tier are sort of who you would expect if you look at corporate responsibility programs. So companies like Chipotle and Whole Foods, A&W, I think made it to that tier or high up in the next tier this year. And then Metro showed substantial improvement. One company I will highlight who unfortunately is not doing as well as we would hope is Tim Hortons. Tim Hortons has a cage-free commitment and has for many years and is not saying anything about what they're doing about it. And so that's one that we really want to spotlight because this is Canada's biggest brand. It's Canada's largest grossing restaurant chain. And they're not saying anything about a commitment to banning cages from their supply chain, which they made many, many years ago. I think that the first commitment from Burger King, which is owned by the same parent company, came out like 10 years ago. So it's been a long time and we're expecting more. So that's a company I'd really highlight. And then I can also say we have some poor performers. I would recommend when I say more about taking action to look at those scores of 0 and ways that you could contact those companies to let them know you're noticing that they're not doing anything for animal welfare.
You want to give us a few names?
Yes, I do.
Yes, of course you do.
One such company is Mary Brown's. Mary Brown's is a chicken chain, and we've seen a policy, for example, to better chicken commitment standards from Popeyes. That's owned by the same company that operates Tim Hortons. There are some issues with that policy right now, so I will say that they've recently changed the language. It's problematic, but the point is there has been action from a chicken chain before, and we would expect to see the same from Mary Brown's. So that's one that stands out to me. And then there's also 2 retailers in the country, co-ops, who are not doing anything public. So Federated Cooperatives, the biggest East Coast retailer, and the Calgary Co-op. Both, and it's interesting because these are co-ops. So generally, I would think as a membership model, they would have more on animal welfare. But they've been very unresponsive. They don't have anything public in terms of animal welfare policies. And as huge retailers, they need to. So those 2 retailers and then Mary Brown's, I would recommend looking at, and then also Tim Hortons in terms of not fulfilling a commitment that they already have.
Yeah, so lots going on there. Ina, if you don't mind putting the link again to the retailer report, or sorry, to the scorecard, that would be great. And folks, I really would encourage you to take a look at it. So PJ, well, first of all, Karen asked, how can the various organizations and grassroots coordinate efforts? Do you see any value in coordination, and how might that occur? So the Tim Hortons thing, I'm hearing some lighters going to light some fires under butts. PJ, is there talk around that?
Yeah, I think that grassroots organizations can do a lot to elevate these issues. And there's 2 things in particular I would say. One is what we talked about with company targeting, which I'll say more about in a moment. The other is looking at NFAC in particular. So NFAC is the National Farm Animal Care Council. This is a taxpayer-funded organization setting the codes of practice for every animal industry, farmed animal industry in the country. And their code of practice for egg-laying hens has a battery cage ban by 2036, but the industry is installing bigger cages instead of eliminating cages. This is one of the most critical farm animal welfare issues in terms of, corporate work and, the most extreme forms of cruelty in the country right now, because we know that over 100 companies have policies. We know hens in cages, is cruel and causes terrible welfare issues. And so we need to pressure NFAC to ban all cages. They already banned battery cages by 2036. It's written in to their code, but we're watching this trend. There's a chart actually in the report I would recommend everybody check out. The chart shows how the decrease in in battery cages in the country is starting to be directly proportionate to the increase in bigger cages. And so we need to intervene now, because we're at a point where if the industry keeps installing enriched cages, they're going to make so much investment in that, it's going to be even harder to get them to undo that investment and have to install cage-free systems after that. We've also seen enriched cage transitions all around the world fail for the same reason, that the only reason they're installing enriched cages is because people don't want cages, so in the first place. And so there's an action on the bottom of the scorecard website page. It's, as it's been shared in the chat, canadascorecard.ca. There's an action at the bottom to email NFAC. It will go to NFAC management. It will go to all of the egg industry association members of NFAC, telling them to ban cages. So I would really recommend, in terms of grassroots organizations, is we need to re-elevate the cage-free issue. We had so many wins on this issue through the country leading up to that ban from NFAC in 2017. And we've shifted so much focus to other animal welfare issues. And now we're circling back and realizing we need to raise the issue again publicly. So that's raising public awareness about hens in cages and talking to NFAC and making sure that they know that the public wants to see all cages banned. So that's a big action that I would recommend. And I know we're approaching our time, so I will mention one other thing that you can do is in our report, we have pages and pages at the end. It's basically a catalog of all of the animal welfare policies and reporting from all the companies in the report. So it's links to what year their policy deadlines, how much progress have they made. And if you go through it, you'll see all the gaps. You'll see the areas that every company is not taking action on. And so if there are particular companies that you care about, that you live in a neighborhood of, those are perfect ones to contact based on what you're finding in the report. And that catalog, I think, is mostly interesting to folks like us who want to focus in on these kinds of issues. So I really recommend checking out. We spend a lot of time cataloging all the policies, creating the report, and it's a really good tool for advocates. I've heard from folks who looked at it last year that it was really helpful for them in kind of figuring out who to look at. So that's another thing I would really recommend in terms of looking at individual companies. So the NFAC action that's on the page, look at the last few pages of the report with all of those particular company details, and then also the poor performers who I mentioned earlier, and Tim Hortons not fulfilling their policies. I know that was a lot. It might have been better if I rallied everything around one ask, but there's so much work to do.
No, everybody's sort of doing different things here, and have different levels of time and everything. So it's great to be able to give a bigger action that people can take if they really want to go in this direction. And PJ, I mean, if someone in the crowd or listening to the replay is like, I want to rally around this Tim Hortons thing, I want to create a citizens campaign around it, would you be willing to work with a group like somebody like that to help them with that?
I would definitely love to talk to other folks who are interested in this. You can email me direct. Oh, I see also my LinkedIn is being shared there. Feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. Feel free to email me at just my name at my PJ Nyman at mercyforanimals.org. I'm really happy to talk to you about what things I think are most effective, just based on the vantage point I have, and also would love to hear ideas that other folks have, because I know that everyone's coming to this with a slightly different perspective, slightly different focus. And I think that to win this particular issue that I was just talking about, which is getting rid of cages here, this is going to take a real collaborative effort and approaching it from multiple angles and kind of using our collective power. So I'm happy to talk to anybody. Please reach out. I'd love to talk more about this.
And there's one question we didn't get to, PJ, if you don't mind taking a couple of extra minutes.
Sure.
Sari asked, I know today's meeting is about food companies and the progress here is terrific. Is there a separate opportunity to also engage with non-food corporations by figuring out how to add the animal justice pillar to their diversity and inclusion and social responsibility activities? In other words, how do we raise awareness in non-food companies? Is that a form of corporate outreach that's happening in the animal advocacy movement, PJ?
I think that there are folks working on it with other kinds of companies. I'll say, I'm not as aware of that because I'm so focused on food system work. So but I would say that my understanding is like the strategy in terms of talking to companies and trying to get animal welfare issues on their radar would be the same, regardless of whether they're a food company or not. You would just be talking about different welfare issues or different species, but I would think that the formula for outreach would be the same. But I'm sorry, I can't speak to more on, work that's already being done in that area.
Yeah, and we actually had a panel a couple of months back on in vegan investing, and so that's a really great way to be able to inform, of any company around the animal welfare or animal justice pillar is by being an investor who weighs in on the ESG and says, "Where's the ESGA?" Right? So yeah,
Exactly.
so anybody that's doing any investing out there, that's a great opportunity to be able to do some corporate engagement.
Definitely.
So PJ, one last thing, we talked about grassroots organizations, but if someone is just an individual and they're out in Yellowknife and they've got a computer in front of them, you're basically saying they could go through the scorecard and the report and they could email each place and just say, hey, what about this?
Exactly. Yeah. It's all public information. Everything that we use to decide on rankings, and then also everything we publish in the report is all public. And so we're basically cataloging what's already out there. And that can be really helpful for advocates because it's often not clear where these companies house these policies or where you would even find them. And so having this catalog gives you an easy place to go and see what they're doing and what they're not doing. It is just looking at those three issues, but I'll say that those three animal welfare issues I mentioned are the most critical in terms of corporate engagement for animal welfare. So that's the place to look. And in addition to that, something else that folks can do if you're at a computer is definitely take action on the scorecard website to talk to NFAC. NFAC is, who we need to reach when it comes to actually changing industry standards. And so that's, you can contact NFAC through our action form, but you can also go to NFAC's website. They have a contact form. They have some contact information throughout their reports, and they have Egg Industry Association members listed. Any folks that you can contact either at NFAC or Egg Industry Associations need to hear from us too.
Great. Thank you, PJ. You know what? I like to honor questions. Do you have a couple more minutes, PJ? There's a couple of
Sure,
other
yes,
questions.
happy
Okay.
to.
And folks, I know that some people have to sign off at 1. That's fine. We'll just do a couple more questions. Jenny McQueen, who you might know, a very, very prominent activist in Canada, said, seeing cage-free campaigns for chickens can be frustrating, as I've seen awful crowded conditions for them too. Not sure how we can justify saying this is really better. Any comments on that, PJ?
Like justify seeing I'm going to assume this is like justifying cage-free conditions because they're
Yes,
also awful.
that's right. That's
I
right.
don't think that they can be justified. I mean, ethically, I think that these systems always have cruelty. Truthfully, if I'm just speaking like as myself, as somebody who cares about animals, it's there's no way to do this without causing some harm to animals, whether even if they have like a nice middle of life, that beginning and end is going to be terrible. And there will probably also be welfare issues in cage-free systems. That being said, all research shows that there are more welfare issues when hens are kept in cages. And there's actually a really interesting resource I came across recently called the welfare footprint. And the welfare footprint actually breaks down hours of suffering and degree of suffering in the different systems. And you can see that it's like, sorry, I don't have the number off the top of my head, but the hours of suffering and of unbearable or intense suffering that hens in cages experience is far higher than in cage-free systems. So it's not to say that cage-free is justified, but it certainly has better welfare outcomes than cage systems.
Thank you, PJ. And Jenny also brought up a really interesting point. She said, do we need a new term for those of us who are abolitionists, but also support the work you do? It's a shame when there's sometimes such a strong aversion to this style of campaigning. So do we have a new name?
I know. I mean, I feel the same way in many ways because, personally, yes, I would like to see the end of animal use entirely. And at the same time, I see the value in working within the system to improve conditions while the system is in place. And so I don't really know. I think that the approach of AJA is a great one. I've seen this on other platforms as well, where it's very collaborative. It's very like the spirit is, we're in this together. How can we be effective, and challenging each other in good ways, but also respectful ways. So I just think like it's great to be supporting each other. And I don't know, I wish I had a term off the top of my head for what we could call that. But I will say that I do really appreciate Jenny and others who are abolitionists, that you're able to see the value of this work too, because I kind of come from a similar perspective and have increasingly seen the value as well.
Excellent, PJ. Maybe it'll be welfare appreciating abolitionists. Well, PJ, this is, if you don't mind taking us off spotlight, that would be great. So PJ can see some smiling faces of appreciation. PJ, just a wealth of information. Thank you so much for your heart, for your intellect, and for all of your work in this arena. We really appreciate it. Animal Justice is looking forward to working much more closely with you in this arena. We don't mind being the bad cop, PJ, so you can work your charm, and we will light the fires under the butts.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I love talking about this, so it was really a pleasure to be here and do that. And if anyone wants to reach out to continue the conversation, talk about other ways to get involved, reach out anytime. And thanks again, Kimberly, for the invite, and to all the AJA folks for everything you're doing here.
Excellent. Okay, folks, can we give PJ a big AJA thank you? And also, gang, just our upcoming Lunchtime Live in 2 weeks, we're going to have Caitlin Mitchell from Animal Justice talking about a campaign we really need you for. It's around Bill S5 and banning toxicity tests on animals in laboratories. So if you're not already on the email list to get those notices, be sure to sign up at animaljustice.ca, or sorry, animaljusticeacademy.com. And we will see you in a couple of weeks, folks. Much love. Have a great rest of your week. Bye, PJ.